Hello developers, so this is lesson number 2 in beginning C Sharp. Alright, so in the last video I had you create a Blazor server app and include individual accounts so that it would create this database here in your local DB. All right, so we're picking it up from that point. If you haven't succeeded with that, please go back, watch again, make sure that that is working well. All right, so now we can move on to more actual C Sharp. So over here in our Blazor app, let us go over here to this page called Fetch Data. Right? And so this is like the core of what I'm talking about when I say it's important to be able to get data from a database, display it, and then, stick that data back into the database. All right, so let's go over here to this data folder, and we're going to look at this file here called WeatherForecast. All right, so this is where the C Sharp actually starts, right? So here we have a file. It ends in .cs, which of course is for C Sharp, right? And so to explain briefly, inside that you have a namespace, right? So and inside that namespace you have a class. All right, so what's the point of having a namespace? Okay, so within a particular namespace, you can only have one of a particular class. And we'll explain class in a minute. But just to show you what I mean by this namespace, because it's just a good place to get started, is that you cannot have two classes inside that same namespace. As you can see, Visual Studio says, oh, we have a problem. And it says that the namespace Blazor app1 data already contains a definition for weather forecast, so you cannot do that. So you could put it in a different namespace, but the point is that within C Sharp you can have a lot of different classes. The whole C Sharp, .NET library consists of classes. Right, so you might have naming conflicts. Like, for example, if you use the word, entity. Well, surely that's already used by the .NET framework, so you couldn't come along and add a class with the name of entity, except for the fact that you can, because you're in a different namespace. So I can say public class entity, and now we have no problems. Right? Because we're inside this particular namespace. But if you were inside something like, system.data, .entity core, they would probably have entity already defined. All right, so that's just a namespace, not something you typically worry about. It's just kind of there. You need to ensure your classes are in a namespace, but typically they are. All right, and so now we get to the meat of the problem here. Is a public class. So these are obviously keywords. They're in blue. Public is just saying, okay, anybody using this class library could come along and use this class. You could have a private class here instead. Private. And that means that class could only be used by this project, so as you can see, as soon as elements defined in a namespace cannot be explicitly declared as private. All right, so we're just going to leave that for now as public. That's just a short explanation. And a class is a very fundamental aspect of C Sharp, and you need to get your wits around a class. A class is simply a template. It kind of says, okay, we want this like business entity, or we want this object, and we're going to call it a weather forecast. And this weather forecast is going to have 4 properties, right? It's going to have a date, it's a temperature in Celsius, it's a temperature in Fahrenheit, and it's a summary, right? So that's all a class is. It just, is an item, it's an object, or it will become an object, so it's a pattern for objects, right? And so, that's really all you got. So that's all you have to worry about. Typically, you can mark these as public unless there's a specific reason not to. And then, of course, your next item here is the type of the data. So in this case, it's a date only, which is different from a date time. Date time has both a date and a time, and we had that for the longest time. And finally, somebody says, well, there are many times I just only need a date. Give me just a date only. Forget about the time. I just want to know, okay, it's Christmas. I don't want Christmas at 3 p.m. or 5 p.m. because it makes queries and other things more difficult. All right, and so moving along to temperature, this is an integer, right? And this is a string. Right? And that little question mark says, oh, this is a nullable string, meaning it can be like completely empty or never set. Right? Okay, so that's just a quick overview of data types, and that's a whole thing into itself. But those are some basic types. All right, and then so the next element here is you're giving it a name. You could name it pretty much anything you want and it'll take it. There's a few rules, like you wouldn't start it with like a number, one date. You see, it doesn't like that at all, but why would you want to do that? All right, and then you have getters and setters. That's a whole thing into itself, but this idea is, okay, you can get this and you can set this. There's more to it than that, but we won't get into it now. And down here in this temperature, it kind of has this special little one that says, okay, when you ask for the temperature Fahrenheit, what I really want you to do is just go 32 plus the temperature divided by this, gives us our Fahrenheit. So that's just like a little function that's running anytime you say, okay, give me the temperature in Fahrenheit. Because really all we're going to ever do is set the temperature for Celsius. But then if we want it in Fahrenheit, we just come over here to this one. It runs this little calculation for us and gives it back. All right, so on this one, we're just calling it a summary. So that's a once over on a class, and this is a data class or an entity class. I call it like a data class because it hooks up to an entity in the database. Now, right now in our database, we don't have that table created. But first we just get the idea of, okay, this is a class and now we're going to use it. So now let's use that. So over here, this is our next class that we create. All right, it's called a weather forecast service, right? So we add that service on anything that, okay, it's doing something for us. In this case, you could call it a data service because it's getting data. And once we got fancier with this, we'll actually go to the actual database and get data out of it. All right, but in this case, we're just saying, okay, we're just hard coding some data in here just for, so we can display it on our screen. So this is a private, right? Like I was saying earlier, you can have private or public. This is static, which means that it's shared amongst all classes. It's read-only in that it will never change. And the brackets right here means that it's an array of strings, and we're calling it summaries. Now, in this case, as soon as we declare it as part of the declaration, we're saying, okay, well, let's assign a value to it, right? So that's a new array, and then it's saying, okay, this is that values, for that array. So that's just creating this array of summaries. All right, and now down here we have a method called getForecastAsync, and we're going to pass it a date, and that's the start date, and then it's going to go in and it's going to just do some fancy creating dummy data and save it to an array, and then return that and display it on the screen, right? So at a very high level, a task has to do with, running things async. We won't get into that because it's a whole endeavor into itself. But typically you use a task when you're going off and doing something like getting data from a hard drive or from an API or from a database, and it's got to go out there and it's got to do some stuff, and you want your code to basically wait for all that to happen, and then once it gets back, then do something with that data. Now that's a really brief summary, but I don't want to get into it more deeply here because otherwise we'll never get done with this demo. All right, so that's our service, our weather forecast service. And we're saying, okay, we just want to be able to come over here and get some weather forecasts so that we can show it on our screen. So now let's come over here to our fetch data. And as you can see, we have an instance here of our weather forecast. So we're using this little syntax called inject, and more on that later. But point is, it creates one for us and populates that. So then it can take, okay, if this forecast is null, meaning there's no value to it yet, display loading. But then once it has loaded, come over here and display this data. All right, so now if you come down here to the code, you can see, okay, we've declared this weather forecast array, and we're going to put that information in there. And then when this page starts up on initialized async, it's going to go to our forecast, and it's going to get that data. And notice over here it says await. So it says, okay, I'm just going to wait right here while you go out and get that data. And then once you're done, I'm going to populate this information here. And once that's done, it's going to trigger Blazor to say, hey, now this is no longer null. Let's put information in, and it's going to now run through this code. And this is more C#. It's embedded here. It says for each forecast in forecasts. So that's plural right there. So there's a number of forecasts in here. And for each one, we're going to loop through this. And we're going to print out, okay, we take the forecast, which is now our object. That object is an instance of a class, right? And then, okay, what's our property? It's date. And then we run this little thing right here, this function called toShortDateString, right? And then here we display the temperature in Celsius. Here we're displaying the temperature in Fahrenheit, and then we're displaying the summary, right? So that's what all this C# code is doing. So then if we run it, and then we're going to go to the weather forecast page. Fetch data. Boom. Instantly it's right here. And if we go look at this code, we can see all that C# code has disappeared, and instead we have the actual values that were gotten from that service, right? So that's an example of going out, getting data, and coming back and displaying it right here. All right, so let us now make a modification to our weather forecast, just to give an example of, okay, how can I extend this? And your task is going to be doing a similar thing of adding another field and then displaying it. So I'm going to come over here and say public string, and we'll make it nullable, and let's dream up something here. So how about something simple like note? get set. Right, great. So now we've added that property, and now we're going to go over here to our fetch data, and now we can add our new property in here. All right, so that's the table header. And then down here in our detail, we're going to go TD. Forecast dot note. You see, IntelliSense found it right there. Now we need to come over here to our service, because as it's creating these, it hasn't done anything to put any data in on our note. So we're going to add that. So now the note is going to equal, all right, how about, I'm just going to say hello world. All right. So there we have it. So let's run this. We go over here to fetch data, and what do you know? We now have a note. And as we see, freezing, freezing, sweltering, freezing is our temperatures in Celsius, our temperatures in Fahrenheit. But notice back over here that Fahrenheit never gets set, because only the temperature Celsius gets set, and the other one is calculated based off of that. All right, so task number 2 is to do a similar thing that I just did, of adding yet another column over here and get that to populate when it runs. And once you've done that, we'll move on to lesson 3.